So I've just come out for literally a couple of casts as it's got dark. Light's just fallen and we've dropped on this cracker on a gunky bumpy. And really it's a really good time as well, really, because the video that I want to put out about does traces affect perch biting. You can see on this one here we've got a big old trace on there. It certainly didn't put this one off. So the questions that I've been asked more than anything else in recent weeks is all about leaders, what leaders to use, should I use wire when I'm perch fishing, all different questions, but all based around the same subject. So hopefully today we're going to cover at least a majority of it. We're not going to go into main lines and things like that because that's another big area that we can look at in another video. So this is purely going to be leaders for perch fishing. So we're not going to be covering big pike and things like that. So no mil-thick fluorocarbon or anything like that. Purely perch fishing and how to sort of pike proof it. So again, I'm only going to share my experiences and how I like to do it. Whether you take anything out of this video and add it to your own fishing, that's obviously down to you. But I'm just going to give you my perspective on it anyway. So let's get into it. So I'm going to start off with fluorocarbon. Now, it is worth mentioning that I don't use fluorocarbon leaders. I use fluorocarbon as a main line straight through to my lure. I use the Seagull Real Soft in 4 pound, 0.16 in diameter. That's what I'll use if I'm using it as a main line. Now, if I'm using braid to a leader, I will use the gunky ice. Now, I've used several different fluorocarbon leaders, and this one, I'm not just saying it because it's gunky. If I wasn't with them, I would still use this. It's very, very durable stuff, very abrasion resistant. This is my favourite one in the range. This is the 2.2 kilo. It's 0.17 in diameter. It's quite stiff, really, really good leader material. Now, when I'm tying a leader up, I always tend to go on the longer side. Again, this is over like just years of trialing different things, short leaders, longer leaders. I always found that whether I caught more or whether it's just a bit of a mental thing, just a confidence thing, tying a longer leader, I felt got me more bites. Now, again, that might not be the case. It might just be how I perceive it because I feel more confident. But when I say long, I'll tend to go 10 foot or longer. Several reasons for it, but one of the main ones is if you're fishing in the winter and you're fishing in snaggy areas, losing lures and end tackle is a part of lure fishing, and being able to retie several times before having to tie any sort of tricky leader knots, it's a lot easier. It's a lot quicker. A lot of my sessions are 2 or 3 hours here and there, so I want to maximise my time on the bank. Tying that long leader, it's not very often that I had to tie up multiple leaders in a day. Most of the time, that initial leader, that sort of 10 foot plus, would see me out through the whole day. And again, if you are fishing over rock and things like that, fluoro is so abrasion resistant. The last thing you want to do is if you're fishing a short leader and then your braid gets a nick, is you set the hook on that fish of a lifetime and then your braid snaps. The same could still happen with a fluoro. It's a lot less likely to happen just because of how durable this stuff is. Now, when it comes to what lures, what techniques I'll use fluorocarbon for, the easiest way to say it is I'll use it for everything other than topwater. Even if I'm using a wire trace and I'm throwing a crankbait on braided mainline, I still want a fluorocarbon leader in between my trace and my main line. Again, whether it's just a mental thing, I'm not sure. But I want that bright coloured braid as far away from my lure as possible. And it's just a massive confidence thing for me. So again, I will use this for any bottom contact technique. So nedding, cheb rigs, Texas rigs, open jig edge with a shad on it. Pretty much any subsurface technique, crankbaits, jerk baits, whatever it may be, I will use a fluorocarbon leader. And again, I'm talking like 10 foot plus. That's my preference. That's one of the reasons why I went onto a mainline, a fluorocarbon mainline, to stop having to tie these long leaders. It was easier to have it as a mainline. But I'll go into other reasons why I've done that because there are several. Some of them are quite important in my opinion. We can look at that over another video. But I think that's pretty much it. When you're talking about fluorocarbon, it's such a versatile material. To say that I use it on everything that's subsurface is just a lot easier. There is nothing that I use instead of fluorocarbon if I am fishing under the surface. The only reason I won't use it on the surface is because it sinks. If I'm using a top water bait, especially if I'm casting it at a distance, my fluorocarbon is going to sink, which is then going to just ruin the presentation of those top water lures. There are certain situations when you can get away with it, but it's not ideal. So subsurface, I will always have fluorocarbon on, whether it's a main line or a leader. But we'll leave fluoro there. We'll look at mono next. So now when it comes to modern day lure fishing, it does seem to be all about fluorocarbon and braid. I know a lot of anglers like the copolymer lines that we have now, but mono is a bit of a forgotten line, and it still plays a huge part in my summer fishing especially. Now when I'm top water fishing, I'll use a braided main line because it floats, and I'll use a mono leader. Now it's not necessarily to get that braid, that bright coloured braid, away from my lure again. Even mono, or even if you use a fluorocarbon, it's still going to cast some kind of a silhouette on the surface. The reason why I use mono is because a lot of my fishing is done on foot. I don't want to be taking several setups with me, so I tend to take one or two. I'll take one with a fluorocarbon main line for all of my subsurface fishing, and then I'll take a braid for my top water fishing. Now, the good thing about mono is, or the bad thing about it, depending on your point of view, it has a lot of stretch in it. So what I can do is, if I'm using a popper or a walk the dog style bait, that has treble hooks, any bait that has treble hooks, top water bait, using mono with that stretch, I can use a faster action, stiffer rod, but that length of mono is going to absorb some of the lunges from those big perch with the head shakes. If I was to use braid straight through, there might be a chance that I'm going to bump a few fish off because there's just no give. You've got the rod, and again, if I want to use something a little bit faster so I can be a little bit more versatile. If I want to then switch over to a soft plastic floating bait with an EWG where I'm going to need a bit more backbone to set the hook, by using mono, I can dictate how much stretch I want by the length of the leader I tie. So if I'm using treble hooks, baits with trebles, I might tie a 6 or 7 foot mono leader. If I'm using one of the floating soft plastic lures with a big weedless hook in it, I might only want a foot or 2 foot, because I still want there to be a little bit of stretch just to absorb some of the head shakes, but I want to have the power to be able to set that hook, and by having a shorter length, you're going to get less stretch. So depending on what style of top water bait I'm using will determine on the length of leader I'm using. Treble hooks, long, EWG style hooks on a soft plastic floating lure, I want it short for that reason. I hope that makes sense. Makes sense in my head anyway, and it's been successful for me. But again, it'll be interesting to hear other people's opinions on that. It's in an ideal world when we go fishing, we can take a setup for every scenario. Because I'm on foot a lot of the time, I don't have that luxury. So I want to take maximum of 2 setups. And if I can take one that's going to do everything, so a faster action rod, and then just use a longer length of mono just to sort of counteract the stiffness in the blank, then that just works well for me. So we're going to move on now to the controversial bit, which is wire. So when it comes to wire, you have to take in the common sense sort of factor. If you're going out perch fishing and you're getting bitten off time and time again by the pike, put a wire trace on. That is the common sense aspect of it. There's certain venues around where I live where the pike are very, very active this time of year. I have to use a wire trace or I'm going to get bitten off. There's other venues where I can get away without using a wire trace. So that sort of common sense thing is not something that anybody can tell you. That's something that you just sort of have to work out yourself. Now, at what point are you sort of compromising fish safety, fish health, to trying to maximise your own fishing? There's got to be this sort of balance between maximising how effective you're fishing for the perch, but also the common sense factor of I don't want to keep leaving hooks in pike. So that's something that you're sort of going to have to work out for yourself. I've got sort of, again, depending, unless I'm fishing a venue where the pike are so fired up, you sort of feel you have to, even if I'm using a technique that I don't normally use, a wire trace. Again, that sort of common sense factor has to play a part. But as a general rule, how I look at it is anything with treble hooks, any bait, whether it's a topwater bait or a crankbait, use a wire trace. Anything over 9 centimeters. So this is a 9 centimeter bumpy. Anything over that, I will start with a wire trace. And again, like, the venue has to play a part as well. If you want a prolific pike venue, just stick a wire trace on straight away. Now, the question is with wire, the big question is does it affect your catch rate with perch? Now, I think it does, but not in the way that we think it does. We look at it as, is that wire trace putting off the perch? In my opinion, I think it's more to do with the fact that the wire trace is compromising the presentation of the technique we're using, which is then putting off the perch. So if I'm using a crankbait or I'm using a chatterbait, something like that, I don't think the wire trace makes any difference whatsoever. I think you catch the same amount whether you're using fluorocarbon straight through or whether you're using braid to fluoro to a wire trace leader. I don't think it makes any difference. I think where wire does start to play a part in your catch rate is if you're using something like a Ned rig, or if you're dragging a Texas rig along the bottom and you've got that length of wire picking up weed along the swivels, things like that. That's where I think it may compromise the presentation, which is then going to put fish off. So I do any finesse technique I use, whether it be drop shot, Ned rig, Cheb, Texas, anything like that. I tend to be using baits slightly smaller than that, sort of, in my opinion, that 9 centimeter cut off range anyway. So I won't use a wire trace for those techniques. If I am, there are occasions where the pike are so fired up on and they're so keyed into, for whatever reason, the Ned rig, I will then use a wire trace for that reason. That, I might not be getting the same presentation, but it's better to catch pike than to catch nothing. So that's when I'll just maximise my chances of catching whatever fish are in the area, rather than just trying to specifically target the perch. Sometimes the pike will make the decision for you, but as a general rule, anything over 9 centimeters or any chatterbait or anything with treble hooks, I will use wire. Any finesse technique, any smaller lures, I won't. And when it comes to the wire trace itself, there are some really good pre-made wire traces you can use. Several brands do it. I've used a lot. The ones I tend to use are the Spro ones. The finesse traces that they do, they're very well priced. They're really good quality, and you can literally just take them out of the pack and fish with them like that. What I do tend to use now, and for reasons which I'll get into, is the AFW. This is the 6.6 pound one. So this is really, really fine wire, really, really good stuff. This, but again, I think it goes up to like £90 or something like that in breaking strain. So whatever it is that you're fishing for, there will be something for you anyway. It's knottable, which is really good. You don't need crimps or anything like that with it. And I use two different types of traces that I'll make out of this. And the first one is what I will use on chatterbaits or any hard baits. And that is just a swivel tied on with a loop with a clip on the other end. Very simple. Just two loops, one loop each end. I'll show you how I tie these, and I'll put the clip in there as well. That's one, pretty much a bog standard wire trace. So to start with, we're going to tie the trace up that I like to use for all of my crankbaits. Anything that's got a big split ring, usually hard baits and chatterbaits, things like that. So take the length of wire, probably got 12 inches or so there. Get one end, create a loop. Take your tag end back through the loop. So it should end up looking something like that. Then take your swivel, thread that on the wire, tag end back through the loop. So it should end up looking something like that. Go round like the main part of the trace with the tag end twice. And then with that loop that we've created, we want to go back through that. Pull it tight from all sides. And then what we end up with Here's a nice neat loop, nice and small. You can see there where that swivel's going to run nice and free on there. Not swivel, sorry, the clip's going to run nice and free on there. Not going to catch anything. Just trim the tag end off. And then on the other end, we'll just repeat the process again. But this time we're going to add a swivel. Same process, creating a loop, tag end through the loop, round the main line twice, back through the loop that we've created, pull it tight again but from all sides, trim the tag end, and there you've got another nice neat little loop that swivel's going to run, nothing impeding it or anything like that. Nice and neat, very, very simple. Ideal for any small crankbaits, anything like that you're going to use. So that's that one. And the other one is, so if you look at, this is a jerk bait, and you look at the split ring you've got there, you can put a clip, you can clip that on quite easily. There's loads of room for that to move around. It's not going to affect the action of this lure at all. But if I'm using a jig head or a Ned head or anything where the eye is really small like that, now if I'm using a clip, what can happen, because the diameter of the wire they use for these clips, it can sometimes get caught and it won't slide along freely, and I think that then compromises the action, again in my opinion, which again it's just a massive killer of confidence, is when you're chucking the lure out and it's coming back in and then the jig head's sort of stuck on the side a little bit because it's got caught on that clip, and then the your paddle tail's not working quite as you want it. That's when another reason why I think sometimes it can be perceived that wire is costing you bites. That's when I will then tie up another style of trace. Now this one's not for everybody, because it does mean if you want to change, you've got to then change your trace and not your just the lure. So I'll have jig head tied on again directly with a loop. Now that is not going to get snagged or anything. Just trying to get out to focus. It's got complete free movement there, and it's going to behave very naturally. That there's nothing on there that's going to get that to behave any different than if you just tied that on straight to fluorocarbon. And then on the other end, I'm just going to tie a figure of 8 loop, no swivel. Again, the reason for that is this is the trace that I would use for things on like bottom contact. So if I am going to use a trace for a Ned, or if I am going to use it on like a shad like that, and I'm going to be bouncing it along the bottom, I don't want there to be a swivel or a clip or anything else that's going to be picking up excess weed along the bottom. I want it to be as less as possible. And by taking the clip and the swivel out of the equation, what I've effectively done is I've made the trace lighter. That's how I like to do it anyway. So the next one, again, take your length of wire, cut that off. Now on this end, what we're going to do this time is going to be very similar to the last one, but we're going to just tie just another nice, very simple loop in one end, just double the line, go back through, and that's it. So that's the end that we're going to end up tying to the to our main line. Very simple. And then on the other end, same process as before, loop, tag end through the loop, and this time we're going to put the jig head straight on there, tag end through the loop, around the main body of the trace twice. Back through the small loop. Pulling it tight. And that's it. That's the trace then that I would use for any bottom contact techniques, anything like that, where you're trying to make the trace slightly on the lighter side, where it's going to be picking up less debris on the bottom, so your swivels and things like that are not going to catch on any weed, things like that. Two very, very simple, very quick traces to tie, which, to be honest, I tend to tie most of mine actually on the bank as and when I'm using it. But that's it. Very, very straightforward, very simple to tie. But that's pretty much it. It's not a complex subject really. Leader material. A lot of it is, again, I don't want to keep saying it, but common sense. But with the wire aspect, it is a very controversial topic, and no matter what you do, somebody will disagree with you. So the best thing to do is just try to find the best balance you can between that fishing effectively and fishing sensibly. Any questions on any of these subjects, or anything you think that I've missed out, anything that you want me to elaborate on a little bit more, just drop it in the comments. And again, I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Cheers.